The rain drummed steadily against the rooftops of Rue des Rosiers, slicking the cobblestones with a sheen that reflected the dull glow of street lamps. It was well past midnight when Inspector Jules Marchand arrived at the scene, his overcoat dripping as he stepped into the dimly lit hallway of the old Parisian townhouse. The scent of damp wood and something metallic, blood perhaps, hung in the air. The constable who had called him, a wiry young man with nervous eyes, stood stiffly by the door, his hand twitching near his belt. "It's in there, sir," the constable muttered, gesturing toward the sitting room at the end of the corridor. Marchand moved forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound on the worn wooden floor. He had been summoned on account of something impossible, though after 15 years with the Sûreté, he had learned that impossible simply meant not yet understood. The room was small and neat, furnished with a plush armchair and an ornate writing desk. A lace curtain fluttered over an open window, though the latch remained locked. The air was heavy with silence. And then there was the wall. A deep red stain trickled down from a point just above the wainscoting, vivid against the pale blue wallpaper. It was fresh, had been, at least, within the past hour. The problem, however, lay in what was missing. No body, no signs of struggle, no weapon, just the wall, weeping blood. Marchand's gaze swept the room, his mind already setting to work. There was no pool of blood on the floor, only the single, uninterrupted rivulet that traced an uneven path downward. He approached the stain and touched it lightly with his gloved fingers. Warm, he turned to the constable. "Who reported this?" "Neighbour." "Downstairs, sir. Madame Charpentier. She heard a thud, but when she knocked, no answer. She swears she saw a shadow move past the window." Marchand glanced at the window again, calculating. The townhouse was 3 stories high, and this was the 2nd floor. A shadow moving past could only mean someone had been inside the room. He turned his attention to the desk. Papers lay neatly, arranged with an ink bottle beside them. The pen rested in its holder, its nib still wet. Whoever had been writing had left in a hurry. A single chair was pulled back slightly, as if abandoned in haste. He scanned the walls, the ceiling. No bullet holes, no slashes. The source of the blood remained a mystery. He leaned in, tracing the path of the stain upward with his eyes. It originated from a small, nearly imperceptible crack in the wallpaper. Marchand withdrew his penknife and, with a careful flick, widened the tear. Beneath it, the plaster was clean, no seepage, no hidden compartments. He frowned. "The other rooms?" he asked. "Checked, sir. Nothing out of place. The door was locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry." A classic locked room mystery. And yet the evidence insisted that someone had been here, someone who had left behind nothing but a bleeding wall. He exhaled, turning his mind to the only thing that mattered. The next question. Where had the victim gone? Marchand turned away from the bleeding wall and moved toward the door, his mind sifting through possibilities. A locked room, a missing person, and a stain without a source. Such puzzles were only unsolvable if one failed to ask the right questions. He had learned long ago that the smallest details often held the greatest weight. He stepped into the corridor where Madame Charpentier, the neighbour who had reported the disturbance, stood wringing her hands. A woman of perhaps 60, wrapped in a thick shawl, her sharp eyes darted from Marchand to the constable as if searching for confirmation that she wasn't losing her mind. "You heard a noise?" Marchand asked, his voice calm, measured. "A thud," she confirmed. like something heavy falling. What time was this? Around 11, just before the bells of St. Paul rang. Marchand noted the precision. And the shadow you saw, was it inside or outside the window? The old woman hesitated. Inside, I think. It moved quickly, too quickly for me to see clearly. But I swear someone was in that room. He studied her reaction. Nervous, yes, but not uncertain. She believed what she had seen. He turned to the constable. The front door? Was it locked when you arrived? Yes, sir. No sign of forced entry either. Marchand glanced back at the room, his mind calculating. If the door had been locked and the window was latched, there were only two possibilities. Either the person inside had found another way out, or they had never left at all. He stepped back inside, letting his eyes sweep over the space once more. The walls, the floor, the writing desk, nothing appeared out of place. Yet something felt off, an imbalance in the scene. His gaze drifted to the chair, still slightly pulled back from the desk. A person had been sitting there writing before they vanished. But then why had the pen been left in its holder rather than dropped in haste? He approached the desk and lifted the sheet of paper at the top of the stack. The ink had dried, but the message was brief. A name, Etienne Lambert. A name with no context, no explanation. Marchand tapped a finger against the edge of the desk, his thoughts turning. Had Lambert been the occupant of this room, a victim, or something else entirely? His eyes moved next to the floor beneath the desk. The rug was slightly askew, revealing a small portion of the wooden boards underneath. That in itself was unremarkable, but beside the displaced rug, just peeking out from the edge of the furniture, was something far more interesting. A button. He bent down, picking it up between his fingers. It was dark, made of polished horn, the kind typically sewn onto expensive coats, a man's coat likely. He turned it over. A single thread remained, frayed at the edges. It had been ripped, not lost, casually. Marchand glanced toward the constable. Have any of the officers seen this? The man shook his head. Not that I know of, sir. That was just as well. Routine eyes missed what they weren't looking for. Marchand straightened, slipping the button into his pocket. He had enough experience to recognize the first signs of deception when they appeared. The scene was too clean, the evidence too precise in its absence. Someone had been here. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it seemed like they had never existed at all. But the wall had bled, and walls did not lie. Marchand stepped back into the corridor, his mind assembling the pieces of the puzzle. The bleeding wall, the missing occupant, the name Etienne Lambert scrawled on the paper, and now the button, torn from a coat that did not belong to anyone present. The answer was buried somewhere in these details, obscured by misdirection, and he would find it. He turned his gaze to Madame Charpentier, still lingering in the hallway, wringing her hands in anticipation. She had been the first to notice something was wrong, but was she merely a concerned neighbor or something more? You know the man who lives in this room? He asked. She hesitated just for a moment, then nodded. Yes, of course. Monsieur Bernard Deschamps. He has lived here for nearly 5 years. Quiet man, keeps to himself. And you are sure he was inside earlier tonight? Another pause. A touch longer this time. Well, I assumed. His lamp was on. I heard the noise, but I did not see him. Assumptions were dangerous things, Marchand knew. Did he ever mention an Etienne Lambert? Her brow furrowed. No, I don't think so, but I wouldn't know all his acquaintances. Marchand watched her carefully. Her voice wavered, but her eyes did not. She was nervous, yes, but not lying, not outright at least. He turned to the constable. "Who else is in the building?" "2 other tenants, sir. A young woman on the ground floor and an older man on the top floor." Marchand nodded. "Wake them." A few minutes later, the ground floor tenant, a woman no older than 25, with dark curls pulled into a loose bun, stood in the corridor, wrapped in a shawl against the cold. She introduced herself as Claire Fournier, an apprentice seamstress who had moved in 6 months ago. Marchand studied her. "Did you see or hear anything unusual tonight?" She shook her head immediately, too quickly. "No, nothing. I was asleep." "You are certain?" "Yes." A beat of silence. "I think." "You think?" Marchand repeated. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. I may have heard something, but I didn't get up to look. A noise, but I thought it was just someone moving about." "What kind of noise?" "A thud. The same description as Madame Charpentier." "And what time was this?" "I don't know. Maybe a little after 10. An inconsistency. Madame Charpentier had heard the noise just before 11. Either one of them was mistaken, or one of them was lying. Marchand regarded her for a long moment. "Do you know Bernard Deschamps?" "Yes. We see each other on the stairs sometimes." "And what about Etienne Lambert?" Her reaction was subtle, but telling. Her fingers twitched slightly where they gripped the fabric of her shawl. "No," she said, but it was not a natural no. It was too fast, too firm. A denial that had been prepared rather than instinctual. Marchand filed it away. The constable returned with the 3rd tenant, an older man named Henri Gautier. He looked irritated at having been disturbed, his nightcap askew, and his expression sour. "Ridiculous," he muttered, crossing his arms. "I heard nothing. I saw nothing. I was asleep, as any reasonable man would be at this hour." Marchand eyed him. "You know Bernard Deschamps?" "Of course. We live in the same building." "And Etienne Lambert?" This time there was no reaction, no flicker of recognition. Either Gautier was telling the truth, or he was a man with nothing to hide. Marchand turned to the constable. "Send someone to find out what they can about Deschamps and Lambert. Check hospitals, police records." As the constable hurried away, Marchand looked back at the 3 tenants, each standing in uneasy silence. Somewhere among them was the first loose thread. The trick was finding it before the whole mystery unravelled. Marchand studied the 3 tenants before him, watching the tension flicker behind their eyes. Each one had offered pieces of the story, but none of their accounts fit together seamlessly. The bleeding wall, the missing Bernard Deschamps, and the name Etienne Lambert. They all pointed to a mystery that had yet to take its final shape. Somewhere beneath these tangled statements lay a motive, the force that had driven someone to act. And where there was motive, there was truth. He turned first to Claire Fournier. Her reaction to Etienne Lambert's name had been too quick, too certain. A denial that felt rehearsed rather than natural. She had claimed to have been asleep, but had hesitated before committing to that statement. If she had truly heard something, why conceal it? "You work as a seamstress," Marchand said, his tone conversational, though his eyes never left hers. "Yes," she answered, gripping the shawl around her shoulders. "Where?" "At a boutique near the Place de la Bastille, Madame Lefebvre's." "And do you take private commissions?" A pause, not long, but noticeable. "Sometimes." Marchand reached into his pocket and pulled out the button he had found beneath Deschamps' desk. He held it out between 2 fingers. Have you ever seen this before? Claire's face barely moved, but he caught the slight tightening at the corners of her lips, the way her shoulders drew inward just a fraction. She swallowed before answering. No? Are you sure? She nodded, but her fingers twisted at the edge of her shawl. Nervousness, possibly fear. But of what? He turned to Madame Charpentier. You said Deschamps was a quiet man, kept to himself. Did he have visitors often? She shook her head. Rarely. He received letters, though. Did you ever see who delivered them? Not. The postman? No, but sometimes a young man would come. He would slip them under the door if Deschamps wasn't home. Marchand tilted his head slightly. Did he ever knock? Not that I recall. Interesting. Whoever this man was, he had not wanted a conversation, just to deliver a message. What did he look like? A bit taller than you, she said. Dark coat, scarf around his neck, even in warmer weather. It was vague, but it was something. How often did he come? Once a week, perhaps, though I hadn't seen him in nearly a month. The timeline mattered. If this visitor had stopped coming, perhaps something had changed, perhaps something had escalated. Marchand turned his attention to Henri Gautier, who stood stiffly, arms crossed, his expression set in irritation. And you, Monsieur Gautier, you say you heard nothing, but do you know if Deschamps had any enemies? Gautier let out a sharp laugh. Enemies? Pah! If he did, he was too much of a coward to face them. Coward, he was the type to keep his head down, avoid trouble. That doesn't mean trouble didn't find him. Marchand narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Gautier shrugged. He once owed money to the wrong sort of people. Gambling debts he paid eventually, but those types don't forget. And who were those types? Another shrug. A man named Bisset, I believe, ran a card game in the back of a shop near the Seine. If Deschamps was in trouble, perhaps he fell back into old habits. More names, more pieces. Etienne Lambert. Bisset. A visitor with a scarf. A debt that had once been paid, but perhaps had resurfaced. Marchand turned the button over in his palm once more. Tell me, he said, his gaze flicking back to Claire Fournier. Did Bernard Deschamps own a coat with buttons like these? She hesitated, just for a second. No, a lie, but why? Marchand held her gaze, letting the silence stretch, watching, for the moment when discomfort would force something else out. And then, softly, her resolve cracked. They're not from his coat, she murmured. He leaned in slightly. Whose then? She looked down. Etienne Lambert's. The name hung in the air, heavier now than before. Marchand's mind sharpened. If she knew Lambert, then she had lied about not recognizing his name. And if she recognized the button, then he had been here. Which meant, perhaps, that the blood on the wall had belonged to him. Where is he? Marchand asked, his voice quiet but firm. Claire's eyes darted to the sitting-room door, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Marchand followed her gaze. Not at the desk, not at the window. The wardrobe. He moved before she could stop him, crossing the room in 3 swift strides. He gripped the wooden handle and yanked the door open. And there, slumped against the back panel, eyes glassy, face pale, was Etienne Lambert. Alive, but barely, Marchand knelt beside Etienne Lambert, his pulse quickening as he studied the man's ashen face. Blood crusted his temple where a wound had partially dried, and his breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. He was alive, but only just. Claire Fournier stood frozen near the door, her hands trembling as they clutched at her shawl. Her expression wavered between fear and helplessness. Marchand turned to her, his voice low but sharp.
"How long has he been in here?" She swallowed hard. "A few hours. I didn't know what else to do." "Did you hurt him?" "No!" she burst out, shaking her head violently. "I found him like this. He came to my door, bleeding."
Barely able to stand. He muttered something about Deschamps, and then he collapsed. "I dragged him here, hid him. I thought if someone saw him like this, they would think I had done something." Marchand studied her, searching for the telltale signs of deception. Her fear was real, but fear could come from guilt just as much as innocence. Behind him, the constable stepped forward. "This man needs a doctor. We should move him immediately." Marchand nodded. Carefully, as the constable called for assistance, Marchand turned back to Claire. What exactly did Lambert say when he arrived? She hesitated, searching her memory.
"He said, Deschamps. He found out?" Marchand frowned. "Found out what?" "I don't know. That's all he said before he collapsed." The words circled in Marchand's mind like a vulture over a battlefield. Deschamps had found
something out. Something dangerous. And now he was missing while Lambert lay bleeding in a wardrobe. The pieces were shifting too quickly. A connection was forming, but it still wasn't clear enough. A team of officers arrived, carrying a stretcher. As they lifted Lambert from the wardrobe, a folded scrap of paper slipped from his pocket and fluttered to the floor. Marchand bent down, picking it up. Unfolding it carefully, he read the words, scribbled hastily in ink, Rue de Vaugirard. Tuesday, 10 Sur. Tell no one, a meeting, a location. And judging by Lambert's condition, it had not gone as planned. The officers carried Lambert down the stairs, leaving only Marchand, Claire, and the two remaining tenants. The tension in the room was thick. But before Marchand could press further, another officer entered, looking breathless. "Inspector Marchand, we have news." Marchand turned. "What is it?" "The river police just pulled a body from the Seine. Matches Bernard Deschamps' description." The words landed heavily in the air, sucking the breath from the room. Claire let out a soft gasp, and even Henri Gautier, the hardened older tenant, shifted uncomfortably. Madame Charpentier crossed herself. Marchand exhaled slowly. If the body was truly Deschamps, then the case had just taken a decisive turn. He arrived at the Seine minutes later, where officers stood in a tight cluster near the water's edge. As he approached, the group parted, revealing the limp, sodden form sprawled on the riverbank. Bernard Deschamps. His lifeless eyes stared at the night sky, his features stiff with the pallor of death. One of the officers stepped forward. "There's bruising around his neck. Likely strangled before he was
dumped in the river."
"No identification on him, but we found this in his coat pocket." He handed Marchand a damp, crumpled slip of paper. Another note, another piece of the puzzle. Marchand smoothed it out, his eyes narrowing as he read. It's too late. He knows the weight of the words pressed down on him. If Deschamps had written this before he died, then he had known his life was in danger. But from whom? And what had he discovered that had sealed his fate? A constable stepped forward. "It seems clear, sir. Lambert attacked Deschamps, then fled, injured himself in the process. Perhaps Deschamps tried to fight back, but Lambert finished the job, dumped him in the river, and then sought help from the girl. It was a neat theory, too neat." Marchand's instincts flared. Something didn't fit. The button found in Deschamps' room had come from Lambert's coat. That suggested Lambert had been in the apartment, but if he had been in any condition, To kill Deschamps and flee. Why had he ended up collapsed and near death himself? And then there was the note. He knows. If Deschamps had discovered something, then it meant there was another player in this game, someone else who had reason to keep secrets buried. But the authorities had already decided. Lambert was found injured. Deschamps was dead. The solution, as far as they were concerned, was obvious. Marchand watched as the body was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, officers murmuring among themselves. The case would be written up soon. The paperwork would follow. A man had died. A suspect had been found. And justice, in the eyes of many, would be swift, but Marchand felt none of the satisfaction that came with solving a case. Instead, he felt the cold weight of something unfinished. Something was still lurking in the shadows, and whoever had truly pulled the strings wasn't done yet. As the Seine swallowed Bernard Deschamps' lifeless form, Inspector Marchand felt the weight of something unresolved pressing against his ribs. The case was closing too neatly, too swiftly, as though the river itself had conspired to wash away the truth. But truth was rarely so obliging. It had a way of surfacing when one least expected. Back at headquarters, the report was already being drafted. Etienne Lambert, in a desperate act of violence, attacked Bernard Deschamps, strangled him, and discarded his body in the river. Injured in the struggle, Lambert sought refuge with Claire Fournier, where he was later discovered. Motive unclear, but likely a dispute between criminals. Marchand read it over, his eyes moving across the words with a creeping unease. He could see how the pieces fit, how the authorities wanted them to fit, but he could not shake the feeling that a different picture lay beneath the surface. Something small, something hidden. Setting the report aside, he turned to his notes. The button found in Deschamps' apartment, the bloodied wardrobe where Lambert had collapsed, the note in Deschamps' pocket. It's too late, he knows. The phrase clawed at him. He flipped back through the case files, searching for something, anything that might illuminate the meaning behind those words. And then he saw it. A name. It was buried in the record of Deschamps' apartment lease, something he had skimmed over before. The property was owned by a certain Henri Gautier. Marchand's brow furrowed. The same Henri Gautier who lived in Claire Fournier's boarding house. A man who had stood in that dimly lit hallway, his expression unreadable, his presence so passive it had nearly faded into the wallpaper. Coincidence was a dangerous thing in police work. It could lull even the sharpest mind into complacency. But Marchand had never been one for coincidence. He rose abruptly, ignoring the glance of the young officer who had been drafting the report. His coat swept behind him as he strode toward the door. The air outside was damp, thick with the remnants of the night's rain. Marchand moved quickly through the streets, his steps leading him back to the Rue de Vaugirard, back to the boarding house where something waited to be uncovered. The hallway was silent when he arrived, the gaslight casting long, flickering shadows against the peeling wallpaper. He rapped his knuckles against Henri Gautier's door, the sound sharp in the quiet. A pause. Then slow footsteps. The door creaked open. Gautier regarded him with tired eyes, the face of a man who had spent years learning how to avoid notice. "Inspector," he murmured, his voice steady. Marchand stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The room was sparse, too sparse. A bed, a table, a chair. No personal effects, no clutter. It was the dwelling of a man who never expected to stay. He turned, fixing Gautier with a level gaze. "How long have you owned Deschamps' apartment?" Gautier's expression remained neutral. 7 years. And how well did you know?
Him? A pause, a measured breath. We were acquaintances. He paid his rent. Nothing more. Marchand nodded, glancing around. His eyes settled on a small wooden box resting on the table. Without asking, he flipped open the lid. Inside, neatly
Arranged were several old newspaper clippings. He lifted one, unfolding it carefully. The headline struck like a hammer. Murder on Rue des Blancs-Manteaux. Wealthy banker found dead in his home. Investigation stalled. Marchand's pulse quickened. He knew this case. It was nearly a decade old, an unsolved crime that had faded into obscurity. The victim, Armand Lévesque, had been strangled in his study. No forced entry, no clear suspects. A crime that, in many ways, mirrored the death of Bernard Deschamps. His gaze flicked up to Gautier. "Why do you have this?" For the first time, Gautier hesitated. A shadow flickered across his features, something almost imperceptible. Marchand pressed. "This is not a coincidence. Deschamps knew something. That's why he died. And you—" He tapped the newspaper. "You have been keeping track of a case that should have meant nothing to you." A muscle in Gautier's jaw tightened. He exhaled slowly, then sank into the chair. "Because it did mean something to me." Marchand said nothing, waiting. Gautier stared at the yellowed paper between them. Armand Lévesque wasn't just
a banker. He was my brother-in-law. The revelation struck hard. Marchand's mind spun, re-evaluating every interaction, every detail. Gautier continued, his voice low. When Armand was murdered, the case was handled poorly. No real suspects, no leads, but I knew he had enemies. I knew there were people who wanted him gone. He exhaled sharply. I also knew that Bernard Deschamps was one of them. Marchand's fingers tightened around the newspaper. Deschamps? Gautier nodded. He was part of something.
Armand had uncovered. A financial scheme, bribes, laundering, money disappearing into the pockets of powerful men. Deschamps wasn't the mastermind, but he was involved. Marchand's mind raced. And Lambert? How does he fit into this? Gautier's expression darkened. Lambert was one of Deschamps' old associates, a petty criminal, but loyal. I think Deschamps trusted him, at least until recently, and that was his mistake. A cold realization settled over Marchand. Lambert didn't attack Deschamps. He was trying to protect him. Gautier met his gaze. Or warn him. The weight of the truth pressed down hard. The authorities had been too eager to close the case, but Deschamps' murder was not a simple
act of violence. It was the result of a secret that had been buried for years. A secret that had just begun to resurface. Marchand straightened, slipping the newspaper clipping into his coat. This isn't over. Gautier gave a bitter smile.
It never was. Marchand turned toward the door, his mind sharpening to a singular point. There was someone else out there, someone who had orchestrated Deschamps' death, someone who had once silenced Armand Lévesque, and now they would have to answer for it. Marchand walked out of Henri Gautier's room with the weight of an old crime pressing against his thoughts. He had always known that truth was rarely a straight line. It twisted, doubled back, and sometimes lay in wait, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Armand Lévesque's murder had never been solved, and now, years later, it was bleeding into the death of Bernard Deschamps. But something still didn't fit. If Deschamps had been involved in Lévesque's murder, why would he be killed now? What had he known? Or worse, what had he been about to reveal? Stepping onto the damp cobblestones of Rue de Vaugirard, Marchand knew he needed to look at this from a different angle. The usual methods, the paperwork, the alibis, the recorded statements had given him a partial truth, but something was still slipping through the cracks. He needed to force a reaction, to let the truth stumble out of hiding on its own. He made his way back to the police station, his mind working through the details. Lambert was in custody, still recovering from his injuries. Claire Fournier had given her statement, claiming ignorance of everything except the man who had collapsed on her floor. And then there was Henri Gautier, the quiet landlord with a personal stake in an unsolved murder. Marchand had been a detective long enough to know that guilt rarely announced itself. But fear, that was something else entirely. And fear had a way of making people careless. Inside the station, he found Lambert sitting on the edge of the cot in his holding cell, his wrist bandaged, his head bowed. The man looked exhausted, but there was still something guarded in his posture, a stiffness that suggested he was holding on to more than just his pride. Marchand stepped inside, letting the iron bars clang shut behind him. "You know, Lambert, I've been thinking," he said, conversationally, pulling a small notebook from his coat pocket. He flipped through the pages as though reading an important detail. Deschamps was a man who kept records. He had a habit of writing things down, numbers, names, confessions. Lambert's head lifted slightly, but he didn't speak. Marchand continued, keeping his tone casual. "Funny thing is, we found something in his apartment. A notebook." He snapped the pages shut. "You ever see him write in it?" A flicker of something, uncertainty or maybe something deeper, passed across Lambert's face. Marchand let the silence stretch. "That's the thing about men like Deschamps. They don't trust anyone, not completely. If something happens to them, they want insurance. A final word, a way to make sure the right people pay." Lambert shifted, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "You don't have anything?" Marchand smiled, slow and deliberate. "Don't I?" He stepped closer.
See, here's what I think happened. Deschamps wrote something down, something that someone didn't want getting out. Maybe about L'évêque. Maybe about whoever really killed him. He paused. "And I think you saw it?" Lambert exhaled
Sharply, his fingers curling into fists. Marchand watched him carefully. "But here's where it gets interesting. That notebook? We've already sent it for analysis. Every page, every impression left by the pen, even the torn-out pages." He leaned in slightly. "It's only a matter of time before we know exactly what was written there. It was a gamble, of course. No such notebook had been found. But Marchand wasn't after physical evidence. He was after a reaction. And he got one." Lambert stiffened, his breath catching for just a fraction of a second. Then just as quickly, he tried to cover it up. But it was too late. The hesitation had been there. The fear. Marchand straightened, his voice turning softer. "You tried to help him, didn't you? You knew he was in danger." Lambert's eyes darkened. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me." Lambert was silent, his fingers gripping the edge of the cot. His entire body seemed coiled, as though caught between the urge to confess and the instinct to protect someone. Marchand took a step back, giving him space. "Someone's still out there, Lambert. Someone who already killed Deschamps. And if they think you know too much..." He let the sentence hang. Lambert exhaled slowly, his eyes locking onto Marchand's. He hesitated. He was scared. "That's why he called me. He said someone was watching him." Marchand's pulse quickened. "Who?" Lambert shook his head. "He wouldn't say, but he had this..." He hesitated. this piece of paper? He said it was the last thing keeping him alive. A rush of cold certainty filled Marchand's chest. Where is it now? Lambert looked away. I don't know. He had it when I got there. After everything, I didn't see it. Marchand felt a thrill.
Of urgency. If Deschamps had written something down, something crucial, then whoever had killed him must have taken it.
But if Lambert hadn't seen it after the struggle, then someone else in that apartment had. He turned sharply, already moving for the door. The bloodied wardrobe. The missing paper. Claire Fournier had been the first to find Lambert that night, and suddenly Marchand had the uneasy feeling that she had found something else. Something she hadn't told anyone. Marchand moved quickly through the station, his mind racing. Claire Fournier had been in that apartment before the police. Before
anyone else.
If Deschamps had a crucial piece of evidence, something he believed was keeping him alive, then Claire might have found it. And if she had, she either still had it or someone had taken it from her. Either way, she was in danger. He barely acknowledged the officers as he strode out into the night, the air thick with the lingering dampness of the day's rain. The glow of the street lamps reflected off the wet cobblestones, casting fractured shadows that stretched and shifted with his every step. Rue de Vaugirard was quieter now, the earlier commotion from Deschamps' murder fading into the usual night-time.
Hush. He reached Claire's shop within minutes, his pulse steady but tense as he knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time.
Still nothing. A slow unease settled in his chest as he reached for the handle. It turned easily, the door swinging open with a faint creak. The small shop was dark except for the dim glow of a street lamp filtering through the front window, where the scent of dried herbs and old wood filled the space, but something else hung in the air. A faint trace of something metallic. Blood. Marchand stepped inside, his eyes scanning the shadows. The back room door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond it. He moved carefully, listening. The creak of a loose floorboard under his weight seemed deafening in the stillness. Then he saw it. The chair had been overturned, papers scattered across the floor. A small wooden box lay open, its contents missing. And there, on the edge of the worn rug, was a smear of blood leading toward the back entrance. Claire was gone. Marchand's jaw tightened as he crouched, inspecting the scene. There had been a struggle, but not a prolonged one. No overturned shelves, no broken glass. Whoever had been here had known what they were looking for. The missing object from the wooden box could have been anything, but Marchand had no doubt it was connected to Deschamps. If she had taken something from the crime scene, someone had come for it. He stood, scanning the room for anything useful. His eyes landed on a piece of torn paper near the chair, half hidden beneath a scattered pile of receipts. He picked it up carefully, the faded ink barely visible in the dim light. L'Évêque, December 12th, 1934. Rue des Écoles. Same man, the same man. Marchand felt a rush of cold certainty. Deschamps had written something down after all. This single fragment, whoever he had identified as connected to L'Évêque's murder, was enough to get him killed. But if Claire had taken the full note, she had the real answer. And now she was missing. He moved quickly, stepping out into the alley behind the shop. The faintest impression of hurried footprints was still visible in the damp ground, leading away toward the narrow streets beyond. Someone had taken her, but they couldn't be far. He needed to think who would have the most to lose if this information came out. Lambert was still locked away. Gautier had seemed more interested in protecting old wounds than silencing new threats, which left only one other possibility: the false lead, the carefully placed deception. Someone had pushed the police to believe the case was already solved, someone who wanted Marchand to stop asking questions. The magistrate. Marchand's breath slowed, his mind sharpening. Magistrate Beauvais had been unusually eager to close the case, to tie it up neatly with Lambert as the culprit. He had dismissed any deeper connection to L'évêque's murder, had insisted there was no reason to reopen an old case. And yet Deschamps had written otherwise. Marchand turned sharply and began walking. If Beauvais was involved, Claire was running out of time. Marchand moved quickly through the streets, his mind focused. Claire had been taken, and the only lead he had, the note mentioning L'évêque's murder, pointed toward Magistrate Beauvais. If the magistrate had something to hide, Claire's life was in immediate danger. As he turned onto Rue des Écoles, the narrow street where L'évêque had been killed years ago, a sharp crack split the night. A gunshot. Marchand stopped abruptly, his heart pounding. A second shot rang out, echoing against the buildings. It was coming from somewhere nearby. He sprinted toward the sound, following the tight alleyways until he reached a small courtyard. The scene before him sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. A man lay crumpled against the wall, his body twisted unnaturally. Blood spread across, the cobblestones pooling beneath him. Marchand's eyes scanned the area, his instincts on high alert. A second figure was there, a woman barely visible in the shadows, her back pressed against the stone wall of a nearby building. Claire. He took a step forward, but before he could call out, a dark figure emerged from the alleyway opposite him. A man in a long coat, moving quickly. The stranger glanced down at the body, then turned and ran. Marchand bolted after him. The man darted through the narrow streets, weaving between carriages and disappearing around a corner. Marchand followed, his breath steady, his muscles burning as he closed the gap. The man was fast, but Marchand had experience. He predicted his next move, cutting across a side street and emerging just as the runner turned. The man skidded to a stop. In the dim glow of the street lamps, Marchand saw his face, sharp features, a slight scar above his brow. He recognized him, Etienne Moreau, a known associate of L'évêque, and now, it seemed, an accomplice to something far larger. Moreau hesitated for only a second before lunging forward, swinging a knife in a quick arc. Marchand dodged, barely avoiding the blade as he grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground. Moreau snarled, trying to break free, but Marchand drove his knee into his stomach, knocking the air out of him. Moreau collapsed to the ground, coughing. Marchand pressed his knee against the man's chest, pinning him. "Where is Claire?" he demanded. Moreau coughed again, his lips curling into a grin despite the pain. "You're too late." Marchand's grip tightened. Too late for what? Moreau didn't answer. Instead, he let out a wheezing laugh, his eyes gleaming with something between triumph and madness. A cold dread settled in Marchand's stomach. He released Moreau and stood, spinning back, toward the courtyard. Claire. He ran, his pulse hammering as he retraced his steps. When he reached the courtyard, the body was still there, still bleeding, still lifeless. But Claire was gone. His breath came in sharp bursts as he scanned the area. The streets were empty. The only sound was the distant murmur of the city at night. Someone had taken her. Marchand's hands clenched into fists. Moreau's words echoed in his mind. "You're too late." This wasn't just about Deschamps anymore. Someone had been planning this from the start, moving the pieces while he scrambled to catch up. And now Claire was in their hands. Marchand stood, motionless in the dimly lit courtyard, his breath steadying as his mind worked furiously. Claire had been taken, but by whom? Moreau had spoken with certainty, with the smug confidence of a man who believed he had already won. That meant whoever was behind this had been orchestrating events for some time, anticipating Marchand's every move. He glanced down at the lifeless bodies sprawled on the cobblestones. The blood was still fresh. Whoever had done this had acted fast, seizing the opportunity amid the confusion. The placement of the wound, the angle, this had been a targeted kill, precise and deliberate. The victim had been silenced, but why? Marchand crouched beside the body, searching for anything the killer might have overlooked. His fingers brushed against something near the man's outstretched hand, a small, folded piece of paper. He carefully unfolded it, scanning the ink-stained words. A name. Beauvais. The magistrate's name, scribbled in a hurried, almost frantic script. A realization struck him. The bleeding wall. The cryptic message that had begun this entire case. It wasn't just a symbol of violence, it was a warning. Someone had been trying to reveal the truth using the most gruesome means possible. The murder, the missing journal, the staged betrayals, it all tied back to the same source. The magistrate wasn't just a player in this game, he was at the center of it. Marchand's pulse quickened. He had assumed Beauvais was merely obstructing justice to protect his own reputation, but what if the magistrate's involvement ran far deeper? He turned the paper over, scanning for anything else, and that's when he saw it. A faint smudge of ink along the edge, as if the writer had hesitated, dragging the pen slightly before continuing. He frowned. That smudge felt oddly familiar. Then it clicked. The journal. Deschamps' missing journal. Marchand had examined L'évêque's old notes, the few that had been recovered after his murder. The handwriting in those notes bore a striking resemblance to the hurried scrawl before him. But there was something else, an ink smudge, just like this one, in the margin of one of the recovered pages. Someone had been writing in Deschamps' journal recently. But why? His mind raced through every piece of evidence he had gathered. The magistrate's reluctance to assist, the conveniently vanishing documents, the staged confession that had nearly closed the case too soon. Beauvais
hadn't been covering for someone else. He had been covering for himself.
Moreau had laughed because he knew Marchand was still chasing shadows, still looking in the wrong places. The real answers had been in plain sight all along, hidden beneath layers of deception. But there was one thing Marchand still didn't understand. Why Claire? He had assumed she had been taken to silence her, but now he wasn't so sure. The magistrate had no reason to harm her, unless she had found something he wasn't supposed to. A memory surfaced, Claire's voice, earlier that day. It wasn't just L'évêque's notes that were altered. There were pages that had been deliberately rewritten. That was it. That was the key. She had found something in the journal, something Beauvais couldn't afford for Marchand to see. He straightened, slipping the note into his pocket. There was no more time to waste. If Claire was still alive, it meant the magistrate needed something from her. That gave him a chance, but it also meant that when Marchand finally confronted the truth, he would have to be ready. Because the moment he uncovered what Beauvais had been hiding, there would be no turning back. Marchand moved quickly through the narrow streets, his mind working furiously as he pieced the fragments together. The magistrate had orchestrated all of this, not just the cover-ups and the obstruction, but the killings themselves. That much was now clear. But what remained elusive was the why. Beauvais had power, influence, and wealth. A man in his position didn't need to resort to murder to silence an inconvenient investigation. There had to be something else, something deeper than mere self-preservation. As he neared the magistrate's residence, he slowed his pace. The night was quiet, save for the distant echoes of carriage wheels on cobblestone. He kept to the shadows, scanning the perimeter. No guards. No sign of movement. Either Beauvais was supremely confident in his secrecy, or he had already fled. Marchand tried the side entrance, locked. He retrieved a thin strip of metal from his coat and worked it in two, the keyhole twisting with practiced precision. A soft click, and the door gave way. He stepped inside, moving with careful deliberation. The house was dark, but not empty. Somewhere, a floorboard creaked. He wasn't alone. He followed the sound, his hand hovering near the pistol tucked beneath his coat. As he reached the study, he stopped, listening. A slow, deliberate breath came from inside. He pushed the door open. Beauvais stood near the desk, a lantern casting flickering shadows across his face. He was older than Marchand remembered, from their previous encounters, or perhaps it was just the weight of the truth now settling upon him. He did not look startled. If anything, he seemed expectant. "You've come farther than I anticipated," Beauvais said, his voice smooth, unhurried. "Though I suppose I should not be surprised. You always were persistent." Marchand ignored the pleasantries. "Where is Claire?" The magistrate exhaled slowly, almost regretfully. "She is alive, if that is your concern. Her fate depends entirely on what you do next." "You had Levesque killed." A faint smile. "Yes." "You staged Deschamps' confession, manipulated evidence, stole the journal, murdered Moreau when he became
a liability." Beauvais nodded slightly, as if Marchand were reciting an inevitability rather than an accusation. "Very good. But tell me, have you asked yourself why?" Marchand's grip tightened. "Because Levesque found something in Deschamps. Writings, something worth killing for." "Ah," Beauvais said, his smile deepening.
"And what do you believe that something to be?" Marchand hesitated. The pattern had emerged, the pieces had aligned, but the core, the why, remained just out of reach. Beauvais took a slow step forward. "Tell me, Marchand, do you believe in fate? That some events are preordained no matter how fiercely we struggle against them?" Marchand didn't respond. The magistrate turned, lifting a book from the shelf with almost reverent care. Deschamps' journal was a work of brilliance, but not because of what he uncovered about Levesque's case. That was merely the surface. He traced a finger along the spine. No, the true danger lay in his theory, the connections he began to draw. Not between men, but between events. Crimes that should have been unrelated, and yet were not. Patterns hidden in the very fabric of history. Marchand's pulse quickened. Beauvais set the book down, meeting his gaze. "Imagine, for a moment, that we are not mere individuals acting on impulse, but parts of something greater. That history is not random, but constructed. That behind every
war, every scandal, every shift of power, there is not chaos, but design." "You're saying Deschamps discovered some kind of conspiracy?" Marchand asked, skeptical. "A truth so vast it ceased to be a conspiracy at all," Beauvais corrected. "Merely
the way of things. He saw the framework, the currents beneath the surface. He recognized that certain individuals, himself, L'évêque, even you, were moving along preordained paths. That no action was ever truly independent. That we are all, in one way or another, inevitabilities. Marchand kept his expression neutral, but his mind reeled. This was madness. And yet, it made sense. Deschamps had not merely been documenting corruption. He had been deciphering something much larger. "And you killed him for that?" Marchand asked. Beauvais' expression darkened. "I killed him because he wanted to change it." The words hung in the air, heavier than any confession. Marchand understood. Then, Beauvais hadn't been working alone. He was part of something larger, a machine that required secrecy, continuity. Deschamps had been a threat because he had seen beyond the illusion of randomness. And Claire? Claire must have found proof of it. Marchand took a step forward. "Where is she?" Beauvais studied him for a long moment. Then, almost amused, he gestured toward the fireplace. Marchand turned. At first, he saw nothing. Then his eyes caught it, just beyond the faint glow of the embers, a sliver of movement. A hidden door, slightly ajar. He strode toward it, yanking it open. The room beyond was dark, the air thick with dust. And at the center, bound to a chair, was Claire. Her eyes widened as she saw him, muffled words escaping through the gag tied across her mouth. Marchand stepped inside, but before he could reach her, a hand closed around his wrist. Beauvais, standing impossibly fast, his grip ironclad. "You will not stop this," the magistrate said, his voice low. "Even if you believe you have won, you have only seen the edges of the truth." Marchand twisted free, driving his elbow into the magistrate's ribs. Beauvais staggered back, gasping. Marchand didn't waste a second. He pulled his knife and sliced through Claire's bindings. She wrenched the gag free, her breath ragged.
"Marchand, we have to go. There's more. There's so much more." Footsteps from beyond the study. More men were coming. Marchand grasped her wrist. "Later! We move now!" They bolted from the hidden chamber, leaving Beauvais gasping on the
floor. The truth wasn't just about corruption or murder or even power. It was deeper than that, and if what Claire had found was true, then this was far from over. The night air was thick with the scent of damp stone and burning oil as Marchand and Claire moved through the twisting alleys, their steps quick but careful. The city was alive, but oblivious to the war being waged in its shadows. Every flickering lantern, every distant voice felt like it could belong to someone hunting them. They had escaped Beauvais' house, but that was only the beginning. They couldn't run forever. Marchand tightened his grip around Claire's wrist as they slipped into a quiet courtyard, the hush of the surrounding buildings offering a brief reprieve. She was still trembling, but her eyes, sharp, relentless, hadn't lost their fire. "We end this," she said, breathless. "Tonight." Marchand nodded. There was no other choice. They had to bring Beauvais down before he buried. "The truth again. I know where he'll go," Claire continued. "There's a safe house. No, more than that. A meeting place. The real architects of this conspiracy don't operate in the open. They gather in secrecy in places people don't think to look." She exhaled, shaking her head. "And I think I know exactly where they are." Marchand's mind was already moving. Beauvais had spoken as if he were merely a piece of something greater. If that was true, then exposing him wasn't enough. They had to catch him in the act, trap him with his allies, force their hands. "Tell me everything," he said. Claire led him through the streets, keeping to the back routes, her voice low but urgent. It's an abandoned chapel on the edge of the river past the market district. It looks forgotten, but it isn't. It's where they meet when they need to discuss matters that can't risk being written down. If Beauvais still thinks he has a way out of this, he'll go there to
warn them, Marchand nodded. Then that's where we make our stand.
They moved swiftly, time pressing against them like a tightening noose. The city seemed to stretch and contract around them, the streets both familiar and foreign in the quiet urgency of their pursuit. When they reached the chapel, Marchand took a moment to study it. The building stood in the moonlight, its stone facade worn by time, its wooden door appearing as though it hadn't been touched in years. But as they moved closer, they saw what they had expected. Faint disturbances in the dust, a subtle shift in the hinges. It had been used recently. Claire swallowed hard. "He's here." Marchand drew his pistol, his grip steady. "Then let's make sure he doesn't leave." They moved inside. The interior was cloaked in shadows, the moonlight filtering through. The high windows in broken fragments. The air smelled of old wood and wax, but beneath it, something else. Cigar smoke, fresh and lingering. Someone had been here moments ago, and then voices. Low, urgent, just beyond the altar. Marchand gestured for Claire to stay low as they moved between the pews, pressing themselves into the darkness. As they neared the front, the figures came into view. 3 men standing in a semicircle, their faces partially illuminated by a dim lantern resting on the stone. At the center stood Beauvais. His coat was unbuttoned, his posture tense but composed. The other 2 men, one tall and wiry, the other broad-shouldered and severe, were listening as he spoke. "They have the journal," Beauvais was saying, his voice edged with frustration. "And Marchand is too close. We must act now." Biscoubador, taller man, scoffed. "And how do you suggest we do that? The prefect will not protect you if this collapses." Beauvais set his jaw. "Then we remove him too." The broad-shouldered man sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You're a fool if you—" "Think we can clean this up? The pieces have already started to fall." Marchand took his chance. He stepped forward, pistol raised. "You're right," he said, voice calm. "It's already over." The reaction was immediate. The tall man reached for a weapon, but Marchand was faster, aiming his pistol straight at Beauvais. "Move, and I pull the trigger." Claire stepped. Out beside him, her presence unwavering. "There's nowhere left to run," Beauvais exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, to Marchand's surprise, he smiled. "You've done well," he said, his voice almost admiring. "But tell me, what do you intend to do? Arrest me? Bring me to trial? You know as well as I do that justice is an illusion." Marchand held his ground. "Perhaps, but the truth isn't." The broad-shouldered man made his move. A knife flashed in the dim light as he lunged toward Marchand, but Claire was quicker. She struck out, slamming a wooden beam against his arm. The blade clattered to the ground, and before he could recover, Marchand stepped forward and drove his fist into the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. The tall man hesitated, weighing his odds. Then he turned, bolting for the back door. Claire started after him, but Marchand stopped her. "Let him run. He won't get far." They turned back to Beauvais. He had not moved. His hands were still at his sides, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something Marchand had not seen before. Resignation. "You don't understand," Beauvais said softly. "This isn't just about me." Marchand met his gaze, unyielding. "It never was." Beauvais exhaled, then, finally, inevitably, raised his hands in surrender. The night stretched around them, heavy with finality. Claire let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. It was over, or at least this part was. Marchand exhaled slowly, the weight of the night pressing against his shoulders. Beauvais stood before him, his hands raised in surrender, but there was no panic in his eyes, no desperate plea, just a quiet acceptance that unsettled Marchand more than any attempt to fight or flee. Claire shifted beside him, gripping the pistol she had taken from one of Beauvais' accomplices, her gaze flicking between Marchand and their captive. "It's over," she murmured, as if trying to convince herself. Marchand wasn't sure it was. Outside, the streets remained silent, the city still unaware of the confrontation that had just taken place. The tall man who had fled wouldn't get far. Marchand had seen to that, and yet something about all of this felt incomplete. Beauvais had been at the center of this conspiracy, but Marchand knew men like him. He was a player, not the architect. His arrest would make headlines, but it wouldn't bring true justice. Someone else had been pulling the strings, someone who had remained carefully in the shadows, and Marchand had the distinct feeling that Beauvais knew exactly who. "You don't seem concerned," Marchand said, studying him. "Most men in your position would be begging for their lives," Beauvais let out a quiet chuckle. "Begging for my life?"
"No, you've already won, haven't you?" Marchand didn't respond. He could hear the unspoken words behind the taunt. "You think you've won, but you haven't." A slow, nagging doubt curled in his chest. He took a step closer, lowering his pistol.
"Just enough to avoid looking like an executioner." "You're protecting someone." Beauvais' smirk didn't falter. "I've said all I need to say, Marchand. You played your part well, but tell me, what happens when you take down the wrong man?" The question lingered, twisting in the air between them. Claire frowned. "Stop playing games, Beauvais. We know you weren't working alone." "I never claimed otherwise." Marchand's mind raced, retracing the evidence, the testimonies, the patterns he had uncovered. They had followed the threads of corruption to Beauvais, but the deeper he thought about it, the more he realized Beauvais had never once tried to run. Even here, at the supposed end, he was eerily composed, because he still believed he was in control. "You wanted us to catch you," Marchand said, the realization settling over him like a weight. "You knew this was coming. That's why you're so calm." Beauvais tilted his head slightly as if considering his words. "Perhaps I've just accepted my fate." "Liar!" Marchand's voice was sharp. "This was planned. Your arrest is part of the design, isn't it? You're the distraction, the loose end someone needed tied up." Claire's grip on her weapon tightened. "Marchand," he ignored her, pressing forward. "Tell me, who do you work for?" Beauvais merely smiled. Marchand clenched his jaw, every instinct
screaming that he was missing something. Then from outside, the sharp crack of a gunshot split the night. Claire reacted first, spinning toward the door, weapon raised. Marchand followed a second later, heart pounding. Had the fleeing man been caught? Was there an ambush?
But then he noticed something else. Beauvais had flinched, not in fear. In surprise, the first genuine emotion he had shown all night, which meant he hadn't expected that gunshot. Before Marchand could act, the wooden doors burst open, and a figure stumbled in, one of the junior officers Marchand had sent to secure the perimeter. His face was pale, his hands slick with blood as he clutched his side. "Ambush," he gasped. "We walked right into it." Then he collapsed. Marchand's mind snapped into action even as Claire rushed to the fallen officer's side. He turned sharply to Beauvais, but for the first time there was a flicker of something else in the man's expression. Not confidence, not amusement, worry. A second shot rang out from outside, followed by the sound of shouting. Marchand knew that voice, Captain Moreau. They had been attacked. Beauvais took a slow breath. "And so it begins." Marchand grabbed him by the collar, shoving him against one of the wooden pews. "Who?" Beauvais smiled again, but there was tension beneath it now. "I told you, Marchand. You caught me too easily." Then Marchand understood. The real mastermind had known Marchand was close, had known Beauvais would fall eventually. So they had planned for it. They had let it happen, because with Beauvais gone, the final witness to their crimes was silenced. And whoever they were tying up every loose end. Marchand released Beauvais abruptly, turning to Claire. "We need to move, now." Claire hesitated, glancing between him and their captive. "What about him?" Marchand considered it, then made a split-second decision. He grabbed a pair of iron restraints from his coat, snapped them around Beauvais's wrists and pushed him toward the exit. "He's coming with us." Beauvais arched a brow. "You think I'll be safer with you?" "Not at all," Marchand muttered. "But at least this way I get my answers before someone else buries them." They moved quickly, emerging into the night just as the chaos unfolded. Figures darted through the alleyways, gunfire echoing against the stone walls. The officers Marchand had stationed earlier were engaged in a firefight with unseen assailants. Marchand's pulse quickened as he saw Moreau behind an overturned cart, barking orders as he reloaded his pistol. Moreau spotted them. "Marchand, they were waiting for us." Marchand didn't stop moving. "Fall back." Moreau hesitated, then fired. Another shot before signaling the retreat. Marchand kept Beauvais close as they sprinted toward cover, Claire close behind. Whoever was orchestrating this had sent professionals, not hired thugs, but trained killers, which meant they had resources, power, and they weren't afraid of making a mess. Marchand's mind raced through the implications. They had been so focused on Beauvais that they had ignored the bigger picture. And now their true enemy was making their move. A bullet ricocheted off the stone wall behind them. Claire cursed, ducking low as they pressed forward. Moreau's remaining men were falling back, some dragging wounded comrades with them. The enemy was relentless. Marchand clenched his jaw. They had played right into their hands, and the real game was only just beginning. Marchand pressed forward through the chaos, his grip firm on Beauvais's arm as the night burned with gunfire. The ambush had been expertly timed, a final play to erase any remaining loose ends. Claire moved beside him, her expression tense, her breath measured. Moreau and his officers struggled to hold their ground, but Marchand knew they couldn't
last much longer.
Whoever was behind this was done hiding. They wanted blood. Beauvais was watching it all unfold with an eerie detachment. Even as bullets struck the stone walls around them, he barely flinched. Marchand had seen hardened criminals crack under pressure, but Beauvais remained unreadable, his smirk only fading when one of the attackers fell, shot clean through the chest by an officer. "You still think you're in control?" Marchand hissed, shoving him forward. Beauvais turned his head slightly, amusement flickering behind his eyes. "I think you're running out of time." Marchand knew he was right. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before this firefight turned into a massacre. Then, through the smoke, he caught sight of a figure standing atop a distant rooftop, silhouetted against the moonlight, watching, waiting, the true mastermind. Marchand's instincts roared. He had spent too long chasing shadows, too long trying to put the pieces together, and now the answer stood right in front of him. He didn't have a name yet, didn't have solid proof, but he knew. The figure turned. Without thinking, Marchand raised his pistol and fired. The shot rang out, slicing. Through the noise of the battle, the figure jerked, but it wasn't a fatal hit, just enough to stagger them. Then, before Marchand could fire again, they disappeared into the darkness. "Damn it!" Claire grabbed his arm. "We have to move!" Moreau's remaining men were retreating, the attackers pressing forward with relentless precision. They weren't common mercenaries. They were trained, disciplined, efficient. Whoever had sent them hadn't just wanted to silence Beauvais. They wanted to send a message. Marchand wasn't about to let them win. With one last look at the rooftop, he made his decision. "Fall back! Get to the eastern passage!" Moreau, bloodied, but still standing, nodded and signalled his men. They moved fast, using the alleyways for cover. Marchand kept his grip on Beauvais, half dragging him as they slipped through the maze of narrow streets. The attackers hesitated. They couldn't risk chasing blindly into unfamiliar terrain. By the time Marchand and his team emerged near the docks, the gunfire had faded into the distance. The enemy wasn't pursuing.
"Not yet," Moreau exhaled, wiping sweat and blood from his forehead. "We lost 2 men," his voice was tight, "and we still don't know who the hell we're really up against." Marchand did. He didn't have the whole picture, but he could see the
outline. Beauvais, watching him closely, chuckled. "You're getting there, aren't you?" Marchand ignored him, turning to Claire. "Take him to the station. Keep him under heavy guard. No visitors. No messages." "You think they'll try to get
to him?"
Claire asked. Marchand met her gaze. "I think they already planned for it." Beauvais sighed dramatically. "Such paranoia. I suppose it's well earned, but still." Marchand cut him off. "You're done talking." This time, Beauvais didn't argue. As Claire led him away, Marchand turned to Moreau. "I hit one of them. Whoever's behind this, they won't just disappear. They'll want to clean up the mess. That means we have a chance." Moreau frowned. "A chance for what?" Marchand's expression
hardened. "To end this."
Hours later, Marchand sat across from Beauvais in the dimly lit interrogation room. The chaos of the night had settled, but the tension remained thick. Claire stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching. Beauvais leaned back in his chair, the iron cuffs on his wrists barely restricting his confidence. "So, are we finally having the talk?" Marchand didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed a single object on the table between them. A bullet casing. Beauvais' smirk faltered for the first time. "You recognize it," Marchand said. It wasn't a question. Beauvais sighed. "You are persistent." Marchand didn't blink. "I hit one of them tonight, which means I can track them. And when I do, this whole operation, whoever's pulling the strings, falls apart." Beauvais studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he shook his head. "You're not going to find them." Marchand leaned in. "You sound very sure of that." "Because I know them." Beauvais met his gaze. "And they don't make mistakes." "You did," Beauvais chuckled. "No, Marchand. I played my part." His voice dropped lower. "You think you've won something tonight, but all you did was survive. That's not the same as victory." Marchand clenched his jaw. He had expected defiance, but this was different. Beauvais wasn't stalling or bluffing. He genuinely believed what he was saying. Claire finally
spoke. "If this isn't over, then tell us, who are we really fighting?" Beauvais smiled faintly. "You already know, you just don't want to admit it." Marchand's mind worked fast, running through every detail, every missing piece, and then like
a puzzle snapping into place, he saw it. Not just corruption, not just power. This wasn't about money or revenge. This was control. Whoever was behind this wasn't just eliminating threats. They were shaping the future, adjusting the pieces. Marchand had been so focused on the crimes, on the victims, that he had missed the bigger picture. The mastermind wasn't cleaning up after a single mistake. They were planning something much
bigger. He exhaled sharply, standing. This isn't over. Beauvais' smile widened. No, detective, it's only just beginning. Marchand turned to Claire. We need to move, now. She hesitated, then nodded. As they stepped out of the room, Marchand
felt it, that gnawing, unshakable certainty. Justice had been served tonight. But the real enemy? They had just slipped away. The rain had started again, tapping against the pavement in rhythmic drizzles as Marchand stepped out of the station. The scent of wet stone filled the air, thick and heavy, grounding him after a night that had left too many open wounds. Claire walked beside him, silent, her thoughts likely mirroring his own. Beauvais was locked away, but his words still lingered. You think you've won something tonight, but all you did was survive. It wasn't victory, it wasn't even closure. Marchand had followed every thread, unravelled every knot, and still, something didn't fit. Moreau joined them outside, lighting a cigarette with hands that bore the bruises of the evening's violence. He took a slow drag, exhaling smoke into the damp night air. You should be celebrating, Marchand. We put the bastard away. Marchand didn't answer. Moreau glanced between him and Claire, sensing the unease. You're both thinking the same thing, aren't you? Claire sighed, rubbing her temples. It's too easy, Moreau scoffed. That wasn't easy. We lost people tonight. Marchand nodded, but his mind wasn't on the battle, it was on the aftermath. It was a distraction, he murmured. Moreau frowned. What? Beauvais played his role. He was always meant to lose, Marchand said, his voice quieter now. He stalled us, kept us running in circles, made us think we were closing in when really we were just treading water. Claire's gaze sharpened. Then what were they really doing while we were busy chasing shadows? Marchand looked up, scanning the city around him. The streets were quieter now, emptied by the late hour and the earlier chaos. Somewhere, beyond the neon glow and rain-slick rooftops, someone was still moving their pieces, and he had no idea where to look next. Moreau sighed, flicking away his cigarette. We should be getting some rest. Claire hesitated before nodding. He's right. We're no good to anyone like this. Marchand didn't argue. He was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come easy. As they turned to leave, his foot struck something, a folded piece of paper barely visible beneath the dim street lamp. He bent down, fingers closing around the damp edges. There was a single phrase written inside, ink smudged from the rain but still legible. Don't.
Stop looking! His pulse quickened. Claire peered over his shoulder. What the hell? Moreau cursed under his breath. Marchand read the words again, his exhaustion fading. They weren't done. Not yet.